Welcome to War and Untold Stories. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. He escaped from the most secure prison in Mexico and vanished into thin air. But how did he do it, and why did they build such a huge tunnel? Let's find out more about one of the biggest prison breaks of all time in today's episode. On July 11, 2015, Joaquin Guzman, better known as El Chapo, was enjoying dinner in his prison cell. He ate his beans and tortillas, chatted with his fellow inmates, and prepared for another day at Altiplano, Mexico's most secure prison, where he was serving a life sentence for drug trafficking. However, his day was about to take a very unexpected turn. Around 5:30 p.m., El Chapo excused himself to use the bathroom. He pulled open the metal door and stepped inside. This was just an ordinary event in the daily routine of the prison. Every inmate did this multiple times per day, so no one paid any attention to El Chapo as he locked the door behind him. But this time, the lock didn't click shut. As El Chapo pushed the door to make sure it was closed properly, something caught his eye. There was a small gap between the wall and the door, and when he looked closely, he saw that there was a small hole drilled through the cement. The hole was covered with a black plastic bag, which was pulled tightly so that no light would escape. Intrigued, he reached into the hole, felt around, and then pulled the bag away. A dark tunnel stretched before him like a gaping mouth, and although he had no idea what lay ahead, he knew that this was his chance for freedom. El Chapo hesitated for only a moment before pulling himself into the darkness. For several minutes, he couldn't see anything because his eyes were still adjusting to the dim light coming from the tunnel entrance. But eventually, he was able to make out a rough-hewn ladder leading down into the blackness. Slowly and quietly, he descended the stairs until he reached the bottom and found himself in a narrow passageway. It was cramped and stuffy, but he had a sturdy metal railing to support himself as he made his way further into the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of dirt and something else, something chemical. He wasn't sure if it was good or bad, but either way, he decided to trust his instincts and keep moving forward. He walked along the tunnel for what seemed like hours until he heard a faint sound in the distance. At first, it was just a low rumble, but as he got closer, it grew louder and louder until he could hear voices. They were speaking Spanish, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. He pressed his ear against the cold concrete wall and strained to listen. Suddenly, he heard his name being called out. "Chapo! Chapo!" Someone was looking for him. He needed to hide. Quickly, he turned and scrambled back down the ladder into the pitch-black darkness. When he finally found his way back to his cell, his hands were dirty and scratched up, but he wasn't going to let that stop him now. He washed his face in the sink and tried to catch his breath. His heart was racing and he could still hear the voices from the tunnel echoing in his ears. But he knew that if he wanted to get away, he had to try again. He pulled open the door to his cell and stepped out into the corridor. Everything seemed normal. The other inmates were going about their business as usual, chatting amongst themselves or playing dominoes. No one seemed to have noticed his absence. He quickly joined them, acting as though nothing had happened. However, deep down, he was already planning his next move. The next night, El Chapo went back to the tunnel. He found the opening easily enough, but this time the ladder was gone. Instead, there was a solid concrete floor in front of him. He knew that someone had been there before him, probably one of the workers who had helped dig the tunnel, and if they could get in and out of here, so could he. Using his shoulder, he pushed against the wall and it gave way, revealing a small hole just big enough for him to squeeze through. He wriggled through the opening and found himself on the other side. The air was warm and humid, and he could hear the sound of birds singing overhead. For the first time since he'd been imprisoned, he could feel the sun on his skin and the wind in his hair. Freedom was within reach. He just had to keep going. As he moved deeper into the tunnel, he saw more ladders and tunnels branching off in different directions. It was clear that this was part of a much larger network than he had imagined. But he didn't have time to explore. He had to keep moving if he wanted to get away. He headed in the direction of the sound of voices, and soon enough, he came upon a ladder leading up to the surface. He climbed quickly, eager to see the light of day once again. When he finally emerged, blinking in the bright sunshine, he was met with an incredible sight. He stood in a field surrounded by tall trees and mountains in the distance. In the near future, he could see a small house with lights on and people waving to him from the windows. Without wasting a moment, he sprinted towards the house, adrenaline pumping through his veins. In no time at all, he was at the doorstep, out of breath and covered in dirt. The door opened before he could even knock, and he stumbled inside. 3 men were standing in front of him, their faces etched with concern. "El Chapo," one of them said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You made it." El Chapo nodded, unable to speak. One of the men embraced him, and in that moment he knew that he was truly free. Outside, the police were beginning to close in. They had received reports of a possible escape and were searching the area, but El Chapo was nowhere to be found. The men led him to a car waiting on a dirt road nearby. He got in and they sped away from the house, winding through the dark, narrow streets of the mountains. As they drove, El Chapo could hear sirens in the distance growing louder and closer. He knew that they were almost on top of him. The men in the car with him were tense, their faces grim. Finally, they stopped and El Chapo got out, disappearing into the darkness. Now safely hidden in a remote location, El Chapo began planning his next move. He knew that the authorities would be searching for him, but he also knew that they wouldn't find him unless they had help. So he took steps to ensure that his hiding place would remain secret. But as days turned into weeks and the media frenzy died down, he began to wonder what his next move should be. Should he stay in hiding forever, or should he try to rebuild his life? Ultimately, he decided to go into exile in a neighboring country, where he could live a relatively normal life under a false identity. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to try anything to avoid going back to prison. And that is how El Chapo escaped from one of the most secure prisons in Mexico. But why did they build such a huge tunnel to get him out? Well, it turns out that the tunnel was actually dug by a group of El Chapo's allies on the outside. They had been working for months to dig a tunnel that was long enough and sturdy enough to allow El Chapo to escape. Once he was free, he was able to slip across the border into a neighboring country where he lived under a false identity for several years. Eventually, however, he was caught and returned to prison. But his escape attempt remains one of the most audacious prison breaks in history. What do you think of El Chapo's escape plan? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and share it with your friends. Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.